I'm Cheryl.
And I'm Naima. We're three Black moms.
Happy Father's Day. I hope that you're planning on something really, really good for your father, caregiver, uh, person who was that person for you, the mentor, the provider, the father figure, even if it happened to be a mother. But today we want to talk about our father and all of the memories that we have. And feel free to think about your own memories that you have. We know that sometimes people don't have great memories of dads or moms, but today we're celebrating a man that we call daddy. And I want to bring my sisters in before I start, and we can start talking about what our favorite memories were. Now, my one of my earliest memories was when I was about 4 years old, and Daddy and I were walking to school, and it was winter time, and it was icy, and I slipped on the ice. And Daddy was big man. And he's strong, and he held me up. He grabbed me before I could fall. And then the next thing I knew, he slipped on the ice, and I grabbed him before he could fall. And it was so surprising. We looked at each other and we just laughed. And it's just so funny because Danny was just, he was what I call an extreme extrovert. He was larger than life for a lot of us. He loved people, people loved him. He had this big personality. He was friendly, where Mama was an introvert. He was the extrovert. He liked to have people over. He liked to have friends. He would invite mom's relatives over when we would have cookouts, which I didn't know for years until my cousin told us. It was your father who used to bring us, who used to call us and bring us over. Now, my mother really enjoyed the company, but I think she was always too shy to ask.
Mm.
And Daddy was that person. He was her person for her who would encourage her to invite her relatives, to invite her people, to have folks. And I don't know, I have so many memories. Daddy fishing. Let's talk about Naima. Let's talk about that fishing trip that we went on.
Oh,
Uh,
yes.
when we were I was 16. I was just learning how to drive, and
Mhm.
Naima and I down. Barbara was in college. He took Naima and I down to Shelbyville, Illinois, and we fished
Yes.
all night long,
Yes,
and
we
went
did.
in the evening and stayed overnight. I think we slept in the car, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We slept in the car, and then we got up the next day, and the fish were biting, and we got so many. We had a cooler full of fish when we came back. And that is still one of my favorite memories. And I was a teenager, but that was one of my favorite memories of being with Daddy. And what are some of yours?
Oh,
I have to say, I remember always thinking how daddy seemed to know everybody. We would go downtown and people would, these people on the street, hey, Charles, and I think it's because he worked at the post office where you know a lot of people from working there anyway. But it seemed that daddy, like you said, Cheryl, daddy had this big personality. He drew people in. He was always very verbose in terms of talking with people, making friends with people. I remember even daddy greeting all the other parents when my first year at college and he and mama were dropping me off at Bradley. And he just got to know everyone so easily, starting up conversations. talking to people that made them feel welcome. He was just that kind of person. And I remember him even bringing us to school. Uh, he was the kind of person that made you laugh. He could be funny. He could tell jokes. People responded to that. He was a very sociable person.
Yes, yeah, he was. And that was the thing that always stuck with me, is that he was loved by everybody and everything. I mean, he he would always speak to all the neighbors, all my friends. And I remember when I was very young, and I guess he had a security job, and he would part of his job was to bring the he had to clean out the vending machines for the evening. And I think it's like at the end of the week, they couldn't leave them over the weekend, that kind of thing. So he had to bring a big basket of them home, or he had to clear it out, but he brought them home. And he would just distribute these things. Vending machines got all kind of little snacks, the sandwiches and the rolls, the donuts, the sweet cakes and all those kind of things. And he would bring them home, and we would just distribute them to our friends. So our friends knew Mr. Charles was going to bring these big container of treats for everybody and share them with them. And it was so funny that, people years later, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years later, saying, yeah, I remember when your father used to bring home them rolls and donuts and everything. Because that really touched their heart. And he did those kind of things. And of course, like Cheryl, you mentioned the fishing trips. Those were the memories. And I remember that trip to Shelbyville, because fishing was his greatest joy. And
sorry for the movement. I had to plug in my computer.
Yeah, you don't want it to go out on us. But he had all kinds of friends that knew he loved to fish. That was his thing. And I remember, and this is one of my favorite photographs that he brought home of him fishing, when he caught the biggest fish out. I'm not sure if it was at Shelbyville, but it was one of his favorite. There was another place he went, was Wolf Lake.
Wolf Lake.
Yeah, Wolf Lake. And his catching, I guess, a record size fish. And he was so proud of it and everything. It was so much fun. But that's one of my favorite pictures, when you can see a big grin on his face. But that trip that we took overnight, it was so funny, because we were just catching fish after fish. We went there in the evening and started fishing, and then stayed all night. And the fish got to the point they were just really biting, especially like at dawn. And we had this big cooler full of fish. And it got to the point it was so full. It was like, if we caught a fish, it was too small, we'd be like, throw it back. Because we had so many. And of course, we brought them home, and our mother had to clean and scale all those fish. That was a task. But I really enjoyed that trip. That was one of the best memories of childhood that we had. And he shared his love of fishing with our children, his grandchildren. We still got the little fishing poles, but when I think there was the church picnic, I believe.
Arnett's getaway. Yeah.
Yes. And he wanted to make sure that his grandchildren enjoyed the trip, and they had their child-sized fishing poles. And, I think Lavinia, Lorelei, John, and Zakia, all had their little fishing poles, and he helped all the children. You remember that, I'm sure, Barbara, that whole trip with the Arnett church picnic, and he really made it special for the children. Yes. So, and as a matter of fact, I remember him. I'm talking about how he spent so much time with all the children and getting their poles together and everything. He didn't get a chance to go on his own fishing.
Yes. But it's funny, because Daddy, I mean, all of us have these memories of Daddy, like taking us to college or taking us, and and he was one of those. He would come and visit me. He visited me. He visited me in Victorville when I lived in California, but before then, he visited me in Broken Bow, Nebraska. And if you can think of a place as remote as Broken Bow, Nebraska, I just dare you to. There were no Black people there until I got there, and then when I got there, there was one. Um, and he came out to visit me. He stayed for a few days. I don't remember if it was a full week. He stayed with me, and we went to horse racing. They used to have quarter horse racing there. You know, they would have a season, and he went and he drank. You know, he had the beer. He was doing the betting. I says, well, did you spend more on beer or on betting? And he says, I don't know. But after he left, he had I had people coming up to me for a long time after saying, oh, I met your father. And he was just one of those people. And on the way there, because we had talked about, I mean, this is during CB times and people had CBs. And Daddy had a CB and he was a fisherman. And he used to drive everywhere because this is before the internet. This is before the satellite phones or even cell phones or anything. But everybody had, you know, CBs. Truckers had CBs, and Daddy loved being on there because he loved driving. And he was driving to Nebraska, and somebody saw him. Now here's this big Black man in this red Cadillac in the middle of Lily White, Nebraska, and a guy gets on the line and says, "Red Cadillac, you got your ears on?" And Daddy answered him, and they ended up talking and him telling him about going out to visit his daughter and the whole thing. So that, you know, no matter who and no matter where, people remembered him. He was just he was just an amazing extroverted social person. Barbara, you probably remember him, you know, going down and taking you to college and meeting your.
Oh, yeah.
I remember that. Yeah, that you could. Oh, and what I remember about when we would take Barbara to college, Ponderosa Steakhouse, and he always called it ponchos. You know, and I remember why, because at the time, the same time this was happening, Barbara bought this poncho because that was a fashion thing. So
That
she
was the style, yes.
Yeah.
And somehow those two experiences got merged because he would always say, we going to Ponchos, and we knew it was a Ponderosa Steakhouse every
Yes.
time we went to take Barbara back to school in at Bradley in Peoria, Illinois. And we always stop by our favorite Ponderosa Steakhouse.
That is so funny. Now, you all might not remember this because you all were very, very young, but I remember in the old days when our parents were young, they used to actually entertain. Daddy belonged to a record club, and he would get albums every month, and they would have like these parties, and he would be playing his music, and everybody would be dancing. When we got older, they probably stopped doing all of that. But I remember that being a real fun time. Daddy would be entertaining. He would just be so funny, and everybody just always had a good time. And of course, we were little, we weren't allowed to stay up. But, you know, they did a lot of that in the early years of our lives.
Yeah, that might have been pre Naima even, because I don't really remember.
I have one memory of them playing, I guess, one of those old jazz records. And the two of them dancing, and it was funny because, you know, the style of dance was like Lindy Hop or whatever the whole dancing. But I remember seeing them do that, and that was quite amusing. Yes, I do recall. And you know, the thing about it, Mama said they used to go out dancing all the time. I guess when they, you know, courting, as they called it.
Yeah.
And so that was a fun thing. But, you know, he was definitely an entertainer, you know, always. And we remember all the holidays when they do the barbecues out back, and, you know, and he had to get the grill going, and our cousin Brenda and cousin Earl, you know, he'd come over to all the children. But it was, you know.
And Daddy would get up early in the morning to start the grill for barbecuing ribs and chicken and that kind of stuff was just a whole day's worth of entertainment, because he would be up
Yes.
bright and early, get the grill going, have the meat all ready when the guests came.
Oh yeah, that was the
And
thing.
then the fire would get real good by the time you finish all the meat, and you say, I don't know, you want to kind of like go to the neighbors after they have any more meat or anything, because that's
Oh
I
yeah.
now
it's really good now, and then there's nothing left to cook. But but Daddy was also good in a way that, because Mama was the introvert and did not
Yeah.
have the social skills that Daddy has. She did not have that personality. Her family, her immediate family was her social thing, but Daddy
Yeah.
made the
He reached
effort
out.
for her.
Yeah.
He would call Brenda, which I didn't find out about until years ago when Brenda came to visit me. Brenda is our
Yeah.
cousin.
Yeah, our mother's niece, but she's
niece.
like a generation ahead of us, because I think she was in her early 20s when they moved to Chicago, and we were still
Yes.
children. So
Yes.
and
So she's our first cousin, but she is a half of a generation, let's say.
yeah, like a half a generation older than us. But
like-
her children were like my age, so
Yeah.
so they come over and everything, and that was our our social set. But it was funny that our families, the way the children grew up and everything, because like you say, Daddy was the one that was the social person and invite the people over and everything. And then I always remember how growing up, like if there was a storm and we worried about tornadoes, our next door neighbor, they had a 2-story house that didn't have a basement. And so they always say, well, if there's a tornado, you need to make sure you have a basement so you can get in, just in case your house gets, the top of the house gets torn off. So he made sure that the neighbors were able to come over and stay in our basement until the tornado blew over. And that was always fun. The children, we don't know, I might get blown off. We're just out having fun in the basement with the neighbors' children.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think one of those barbecues, because now Brenda is Mama's side of the family, but Joe was one of his brothers.
Yeah,
Daddy was the oldest. He was one of 10, but he was the oldest boy and the second child. And one of his younger brothers, Joe, had kids, and so he would, he had, siblings. There were a few siblings that lived in Chicago.
Yeah.
Cousin Tisa still talks about coming over to our house and having a ball that day, when she came over, on trips when Joe came over and brought her.
Yeah. And Shirley and them, all his other children, they still talk about when he used to bring home the rolls and the donuts and everything years after that, So, I mean, he had such an impact, and he had an impact on just even animals, because he was just a loving person. And one thing I always remember, which I follow to this day, he would always say, never throw away food, because there's always someone or something that can eat it. So he would save our table scraps and take them to this place. Him and his friends would hang out at one of the kind of like the alley mechanic shop where he'd get my car worked on, and his friends hung out. It's kind of like a junkyard place and they had these stray dogs that they would feed. So he would always take the scraps over to the dogs, and they got to the point where the dogs recognized his car. When they saw when he started to pull up, they'd come running because they knew it was Mr. Charles with the scraps. And he fed the dogs and everything. And he would even buy, from those street vendors, he would buy the peanuts from them so he could feed the squirrels. And because I was trying to tell the people in the house, now look, we got a long relationship with these squirrels. That's why they're so friendly. That's why they're so bold, coming and sit on our porch and everything, because they're used to the kind of relationship he had with them. He would sit out there on the porch, feed the squirrels and everything.
That would be a generational memory, because those squirrels are long gone.
Yeah, but I'm sure they pass it on. They live in our tree, They still, and if he hadn't been sitting out there for a long time, like a couple of days, he hadn't been sitting there, they would come and knock on the door like, "Where you at? Where are peanuts?"
Yes. I remember
they were used to him coming, sitting and feeding them.
Yeah, I remember coming home once when I lived in California, and he was roasting peanuts. I says, "Oh, you roast?" He says, "Yeah, I'm roasting them for the squirrels because if I give them to them raw, when they plant them, they forget where they planted them." And he says, "I had peanut plants coming up all over the lawn. So what I do now, I roast them, and then if they plant them, then they're not going to grow." But that was what was so funny, is that he didn't say, "Well, I'm not going to give the squirrels anything anymore. I'm just going to fix it so that they can eat them now or never, but they're not going to be planting these things, because once they sprout, they couldn't eat them either." But it was just funny how he would do that. He would sit on the porch and the neighborhood kids would come by and talk to him. Our neighbors' kids knew him. And they're like, those were our friends' children, which would be like grandchildren. And he just made friends with everyone. He got to know them, and they knew him. He was always sitting out there and kind of observing, and it was just interesting how impactful he was in our neighborhood.
Yes.
And remember how patient Daddy was in helping us when we were first learning how to drive.
Yeah.
I know with Mama, he would be yelling, but with us, he was really patient. You know, they tell you not to ever have your spouse try to teach you how to drive. I mean, even in that show, Father Knows Best, they had that episode where the dad was trying to show his wife how to drive, and he was just so frustrated with her. It was like his whole personality changed, and finally they figured out it was better for her to have a professional be the person who had to teach her how to drive and not her husband.
Let me tell you something. Don't let your spouse teach you nothing. Spouses should not try to teach each other anything. And my husband was very, very good at tech, IT. He was an IT guy.
Yeah.
And he was very good at teaching. He was very patient. And especially when we were first getting to know each other, because we weren't married. That changed when we got married. After that, if I ask him something, it's like, "Oh, that never happens for me." So I says, "Okay." So anyway, I remember telling you, Barbara, about how scared I was when I was getting ready to learn how to drive, because Daddy had that great big voice, and I didn't want him yelling at me because that would be upsetting me to no end. And you said, "Oh, don't worry about it. He's not going to yell at you until you know what you're doing." And he was very, very patient. Funny how what happened afterward was, because when it came time for me, now Mama was different. We used to have those cars that had one big long bench in the front, and Mama would practically sit on your lap and put her foot over so she could hit the brake and the gas. So it's hard for you to drive with somebody sitting on your lap. And he was different. So what I found out, because she was a nervous Nelly, when it came time for Sarah to learn how to drive, I was Mama. And I was so bad at it. Sean was Daddy. Sean was very, very patient with her. And I had to admit it. He's better than me at this. Let him do it, because Sarah always thought it was because I was worried about my car. But no, I'm just a nervous Nelly. And so that was what was funny, is that you find out who you are from your parents later on.
Yes. Yeah, it's so funny because he was so patient with us, and and I guess also he was older by the time we learned how to drive, because they were younger when he was trying to teach Mom, and she was a grown adult, and it's not as easy to learn things when you're older. But he was always so patient with us driving. And the whole relationship in that car with he and I, because as I got older, and a lot of times I was sort of the one that had to drive him or take him to his hospital visits and things like that. You know, as they get older and they got those issues, they got to see the doctor. He's kind of going through that phase. We had a lot of time together in the car, whether he was driving me someplace, maybe dropping me off at work, or I'm driving him, you know, to take him to his appointments. And we would always have these talks, and we would, you know, because we'd have these, my spouse is driving me crazy conversations. We'd just be laughing and laughing. You know, he'd tell me something that mom had done, and I tell him something that my husband Sultan had done, and we'd just be laughing and laughing. And one time he said, you know, you married your mama, don't you? Because sometimes they'd be doing the same thing and they're both driving us crazy. But, you know, one time he said something just was so wise. And I thought, that's the best attitude you can have about marriage. Because he said something that mom had done, just made him so mad. It just drove him crazy. And then he finally said, oh, well, she can't help how she is no more than I can help how I am.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's really a wise way of looking at marriage. Just acceptance. Accept all the idiosyncrasies, because that's just who they are. And you'll be okay. So I thought that's one of the best words of advice for anybody that's getting married. Your spouse is the way they are. Just accept it, because you can't change them and they can't change you. But
and I also remember Daddy had a lot of wisdoms about driving. He would say, if you give somebody else a break, they will give you a break. That's in traffic. You need to let somebody in. And those words still come to, and I'm like been driving for 52 years now. And I just say, you know, those words are still in my head. You give them a little wave. If they let you in, you let somebody in.
Always thank them if they give you a break and let you in traffic. Just in it. I remember you always do that. Just give them a little wave, you know, if they let them in.
Yes, your thank you wave. Jerry Seinfeld even had an episode about that once. And it was so funny. You know, those were the kinds of things. But I also remember this one story about Daddy when he was telling us about him going to the grocery store, going home, and finding that some of his groceries were missing. He went back to the store and he gave them hell about them forgetting to put his bags in. And they apologized. And then he came home, looked at his car, and found it. He said, I wasn't proud. You know, I went back up and I apologized. And I always thought how much integrity we have to be able to go back after you've raised Cain somewhere and say, you know what? I was wrong. I found this. You did not do what I said you were. And I just thought that is so much integrity that is missing today, because we will do everything to keep from apologizing and to being held accountable. So he taught us that. He taught us
that. He
embarrassing. And he didn't have to tell us that story either.
But he was, and it was a good example of being able to be humble enough to admit when you're wrong. And I think that's one of the best lessons. And people all over the block, if they grew up during our time, they say they really miss him just sitting out on the porch. It's like he was watching over the block, and they miss him taking those walks up and down the block. He was a part of everybody's life. And that's a special memory that we have. So Barbara, I know we've got to go. You've got the last word. Give us one of your last fond memories of our father.
I like how Daddy would say Jesus wept at the table when we were having Thanksgiving. Everybody would go around. And that was the shortest thing. That's the shortest verse in the Bible. And Daddy would always say that. And I would always wonder what that meant, you know, when you're a little kid. But one of those things I really liked about Daddy was just his being able to listen to you when you were telling him your stories and him telling you all of his. One of his war stories that I remember was how this can of beans was being heated up in the tailpipe of their car that they had out on the road, and the beans got so hot they exploded. And he said him and his fellow soldiers went and they found every single one of those beans to eat. That was their meal. I was impressed with that story. That was really wild.
They didn't waste the bean. I remember that story.
One.
Yes. Well, that last big story, and I know we got to go, but our father was shot through the heart in World War II.
Well,
And
about
it was thought that
the
he did.
heart.
And it was just like on the downbeat of the heart. So it just missed his heart.
Yes.
And then the blood squirted out on the next beat, and they saw the blood squirt. Now they were like, oh, he ain't gonna make it. So when they got him to the hospital, they pronounced him dead and put the sheet over his head. And but the nurse forgot to take the oxygen mask off his face. So somehow he started breathing again. And so as they were coming in to take his body to the morgue, they saw the sheet going up and down, and they realized he was still alive. But they had sent a telegram to his family that he was dead. And so that act of forgetfulness saved his life. And he remembers the name of the nurse. He said Nurse Murphy. She was the one that forgot to take the mask off his face, and that's what saved his life.
And that's why we're here today.
And that's why we're here today. So thank you, nurse, for forgetting to take the mask off our father's face. He's quite a phenomenal man with a phenomenal life, and we're just so grateful to have been the daughters of Mr. Anderson Childs. Well, we've got to go, but we hope you have a happy Father's Day, and remember those great memories of your father and share them with your children, because these are the things that live forever. Make sure you like and subscribe our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, 3 Black Moms, so you can get notices whenever we go live. And until next time, I'm Naima.
I'm Cheryl.
I'm Barbara. We are 3 Black Moms. Hi, I'm Barbara.
I'm Cheryl.
And I'm Naima. We're 3 Black Moms.